Okay. Shall we continue?
Yep.
As a small talk before we start, I would also like to add another remark, especially when we talk about Aldo Rossi and the Italian school of urban design, which is so much connected to composition in a most large understanding of the processes and themes, whereas the modernist direction which we were talking about after the Second World War was largely shaped by Bauhaus, which is a really interesting conundrum in a way, where Bauhaus starts with traditional composition, almost poetic and metaphysic composition, also including all of these fantastic modern or avant-garde painters and collagists. But at the same time, the Bauhaus, in a way, ends up with something that is a total design, where composition has lost its power, and composition in wider sense, where history, culture, social events, all of it become a part of the concept that is composed as a poetic and also as a slightly magical artifact or event itself. They lose. So the design, in a way, answers the question how to proceed, how to solve the problem, whereas the composition has much wider and more powerful system of building things. And this is a very interesting thing. I've tried to investigate it, but it doesn't give itself easily. But I think the criticism of Adolf Loos in his book Decoration as Crime, or Decoration as something that has to be abolished, of course, that is of that particular moment, which is very, very interesting. Just as a kind of theme of thought for the students, keep in mind this dichotomy that here and there again and again in different cultures appear between design and composition. But I think we should continue.
Yeah, it's a very interesting remark which connects to this difference between planning and design, basically. Urban design versus urban planning is actually different, even though being obviously connected, pertaining to different realms, almost, and being driven by different, not only scales or ideas, but also elements, like what do you engage with when you design or when you plan. And obviously, if we look at the Italian school that you're mentioning now, to be fair, I feel a bit bad just mentioning Rossi now only, because it's so rich, and there are so many great architects and talents, from Vittorio Gregotti to Giorgio Grassi, and so talking about postmodern period of architecture and urban design in Italy, and just mentioning Rossi is really very unfair to them. But these are the limitations of time. So yeah, as a good postmodern, we could say that we just pick fragments of them, right? So we don't give full views of even movements or regional schools, but just little fragments of them. Okay, let's move back to the presentation. Perfect. Colin Rowe and Fred Ketter, even though it's always assigned to or attributed to Colin Rowe as the main author, but the book College City was co-author between Colin Rowe and Fred Ketter. College City. Rowe also engages similarly in a critique of modernistic principles of urban planning in their normative ambition, but also especially in the type of space, in the result of their principles of planning and city building. And similar to Rossi, also claims, shows an interest in history and claims the instrumental role that history may have when it comes to understanding the city and designing the city of the future, right? So giving a very important aspect. So understanding, again, the city as a continuous evolution, and then claiming that is essential, the understanding and the dialogue with historical elements in order to move forward. So claiming back something that the modern movement had, as we've seen before, completely erased or had completely detached from any reading or understanding of history as belonging to the past, right? And aiming to create a new civilization, a new world, a new society, and so on and so forth. Colin Rowe really is part of this new generation that claims back the importance of history in order to lead the future, right? If we don't understand the past, we cannot really move forward or construct a better future. But as I said, he puts also an interesting analysis or critique that he makes is really the spatial one. And then he uses this kind of common terms, or what has become by now probably a pretty common use of urban analysis through the solid and the void, right? Looking at these two type of contrasting elements in order to determine urban fabrics or urban structures. And he claims that the matrix of the city has become transformed from a continuous solid to a continuous void. A continuous solid, which would be the historical city, the history of the past, which has been largely formed by this assemblage of matter, let's say, this continuous solid matter, towards a new paradigm, the modernistic paradigm, which is largely based on an empty space, on void, right? And where the construction really are a series of scattered dots almost, or little objects sitting on this ever-expanding void. So it's a negative, positive, negative relation. It's a completely different spatial understanding. And he provides a series of examples of analysis that he's made, for instance, comparing a project by Le Corbusier from Saint-Dié and the city of Parma, right? What the diagrams or the drawings you have on the right-hand side, the top image, the project by Le Corbusier, and the lower, the image on the bottom, the solid void representation of the city of Parma in Italy. So Italy is going to become a major reference from Colin Rowe, even though he's English, and also like going back to the sources of legitimation of architecture to the ancient Rome and so on and so forth. So while engaging in this analysis, he writes that one of the cities is almost white, whereas the other one is almost black. The one, an accumulation of solids in a largely unmanipulated void, the other, an accumulation of voids in a largely unmanipulated solid. And in both cases, the fundamental ground promotes an entirely different category of figure, which goes back to this idea of composition that Yuri was talking about, right? In the one object, in the other space. So for Rowe's analysis, in the historical city, this city, which is a solid kind of space or matter, the process consists almost in excavating this series of voids from the substance of the city, right? From the solidity of the city. And by excavating these voids, we've created the streets networks, but also the public spaces, the representational or symbolic spaces, and we kind of give form to this full kind of solid. Whereas the modernistic paradigm is a complete other, is a complete empty void where we situate some objects as references, which have generate a complete different perception, almost like we see them, we look at them from the distance, we recognize them as unique, independent objects, one different from the other. So there's no continuity of the street or square. There's no continuity of the urban space as defined in the old city. And he goes, as I mentioned, really back to the classic ancient times, both to Greece and to Rome as sources of inspiration. And he claims also, very bluntly, why should be obliged to prefer a nostalgia for the future to that for the past, arguing that modernism, what it's doing is basically channeling a nostalgia for the future, right, into the practice of urban planning or of architecture. This kind of belief that every future is best, right? And he claims, why can we do the same really with the past? I mean, wouldn't be equally legitimate to dwell in the nostalgia for the past? Could not this ideal city behave quite explicitly as both a theatre of prophecy and a theatre of memory? So the idea of, sorry, I forgot to turn on the recording. Could not this ideal city behave quite explicitly as both a theatre of prophecy and a theatre of memory? So the question of memory becomes also really important to connect to the past of the history, to historical references, and to motivate readings and meanings of the city in the present and in the future. So it's not only an interest in history, but it's the mobilization of memory as a tool to understand, perceive, but also design the city, right? And then goes back to classic examples of the Acropolis in Athens or Rome, the imperial fora in Rome, in a kind of very close, detailed analysis of the architecture of these places, of the morphology of these places, right? How this materiality is really defined through compositions, going back to, again, Yuri's questions, the interest in composition, not as a fully regulated plan, following strict rules and principles, but actually as a question of design, as a question of composition, as a question of relations between objects, depths, widths, materialities, angles, so on and so forth. So ultimately, what Rowe proposes is a collage city, a city of fragments from the past, present, and future, taking inspiration from working examples in existing cities, some scientific, others picturesque, some intrigue, others contemporary, some may be rational, whilst others disordered. So the city is this assemblage of differences, different objects, architectural expressions of different periods, but also of different styles, of different scales, of different forms, and all of this richness creates at the end the character of the city, right? So what's the unimportant feature or the only important factor would be the quality of those pieces of architecture. In this sense, he gets close to a liberal understanding or political economic understanding of the city, right? As a conflicting, as almost as a competition, as opposed of a regulated planned economy. He advocates more of conflicting architectures with different inspirations emerging from different sources, and almost negating or opposing to a full comprehension of the city, or in other words, understanding the city as this space of diversity, as this space of freedom, as this space of competition and conflict through architectural expression. So the college city would offer the poetics of utopia, but the juxtaposition and layering of smaller designs into a whole, rather than totalitarian, would allow for the city to be free of the unchangeable finality of utopian politics. A postmodern composition lacking prescription of remembrances, so going again back to memories and the power of memory to revitalize or to recreate meanings, shifted context, recycled meanings, metamorphoses, allowing the city to create itself, to read itself, and to form its own meanings from borrowed fragments. Yet again, the idea of the fragment, the critique of totalitarian imposition of a normative order, and the freedom and the diversity, conflictual diversity, as the substance of the city. Another author working on the same time, and in fact teaching at the same university that Colin Rowe in Cornell University at the same time, and with apparent similar approaches and differences, but with quite essential divergences or differences to the point that they kind of didn't get along too well. In this goes more maybe into the gossip part of history, but there's an interesting histories about their roles and their relation both at Cornell University and their differences also. Anyhow, and one of them was very much deals with the role of history. But what I would argue is quite consistent in both is the shift from the planning to the detail, to the fragment, to the architecture as expression of a city through its representation, right? Through its strictly architectural expression. So in The Dialectic City, Ungers wrote that the city is made up of complementary places rather than being a unified concept, like the ideal city of the Renaissance or so on. Therefore, an appropriate method must be found in identifying the character of these very disparate places, defining it and developing its specific features, either by adding the functions that are lacking or by perfecting the existing ones. And in this sense, Ungers engages directly and in a very straightforward way with a pluralistic ideology, liberal pluralistic political position, where again, the city is expressed through its differences, as opposed of a kind of homogenizing vision or the search for one unique character or expression of the city. Precisely the nature of the city is the difference, is the addition of many even contradicting expressions or pieces of architecture. So the antithesis of current planning theory, which stems from a definition of city as a single whole, again, the same critique that the previous authors had made, it corresponds to the contemporary structure of society, which develops more and more as a society and individuals. So there's even this negation of a society as an existing entity, right, as a social body, whereas according to his belief and the kind of liberal or the neoliberal belief, society is nothing else than a series of individuals where with their freedom of choice and where they're with their individual ideas and affinities and sympathies and so on. So there's not such a thing as a society without considering the individual. So the unit of society is eventually the free individual, let's say. It is, from a political and social point of view, a pluralist concept in which many ideological visions find their own place next to one another. So even again insisting, diving in the same idea, society, or for that matter, the city, is the expression of a variety of positions, of a variety of styles, of a variety of ideologies and visions, right, which express themselves and coexist in their differences in the city. This is the type of approach that he took in the city, a project for Berlin, a city in retraction, a city in retreat, a competition for the city where Ungers noted that Berlin was losing population, so was shrinking in terms of demographics. So he proposed a plan which was the contrary opposite to a plan of expansion, which has been typically the role of urban planning, right? To organize the city growth, the city development. He proposed quite the opposite, which was how to plan the shrinking of a city. And therefore, he was confronted with these questions of how to decide what should be kept or what should disappear, how to shrink, how to reduce, how to, at the end, dismiss from this planning process of retreat. And then he directly applied these ideas we've just seen. And he engaged in a thorough mapping or cartography of architectures in the city that had strong character and that, according to him, form or contain the essence of Berlin, right? And this could be just a building, or it could be an urban space like a square, or it can be also a piece of an urban fabric or a pattern, but distinct elements, formally distinct elements that could, that embodied the essence of Berlin, right? So according to this analysis, if you just keep all of these little fragments, all of them making up the character of Berlin, and you lose everything else, if you delete everything else, you would still keep the urbanity of Berlin intact, right? Because you would have kept the essence of the city through this composition of fragments. So through a series of maps, cartographies, drawings, photographies, he elaborates this full vision of the essence of Berlin through the fragments, and eventually these are the pieces he identifies. And so these are the pieces to be kept, the architectural fragments to be kept. And the rest is given over to nature. So in a process of recolonization of the city from nature, through a kind of greening process, the rest would be just becoming a park or wild nature. Of course, that was a paper project never fully realized, but it really shows, I think, expresses very well the ideology and the design techniques behind this kind of approach to the architectural city, and the complete rejection of the role that overall planning may play in defining the city. So in that respect, these three authors coincide in their value or the interest in the fragment or the architectural object. However, they also differ very much from, for instance, the interest in Rossi and the reading of Ungers differ very much from the role of geography or the role of territory or the role of what a regulating plan can be, for instance. In the three of them also sharing a great interest in type, right? Because these architectural fragments many times are defined by architectural types and classifying types of architecture and geometrical orders and so on. I'll skip a couple of examples to just counteract or confront Blows and Unger's approaches in this kind of compositional design of the city through distinct geometrical orders and sequences and relations, but we don't really have time for that. And a third author, which we're gonna go very fast, although it would require a full lecture for himself only, like many others also. Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas, and this project for the City of the Captive Globe project, developed by Rem Koolhaas and Madeleine Vriesendorp, which kind of mixes both elements presented so far. So on the one hand, it's a project for Manhattan, it's a project for New York. So he fully embraces the power of the grid as a regulating underlying order, as a regulating structure, right? As a normative. So the grid and the urban block as the unity of the city. But on the other hand, he breaks this repetition and homogeneity by applying or by fully embracing with the potential that the urban block has in being a distinct unit or a distinct module than the other. So by assigning to every block a complete different character, a complete different architecture. And we see in the drawing, for instance, some reference to Le Corbusier's cross skyscrapers, to some kind of self-design, or even the sculptural projects by Malevich, or some kind of surreal sculptures from Dali and so on. So again, basically the cities, in this case maybe a bit more nuanced, it is a conflict, is a contrast, is a diversity of architectures, expressions, characters, meanings, ideologies, so on and so forth.